welcome to the transport seminar. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Dinesh Mohan. If I go and read his resume on Wikipedia, I'll take the entire day to finish, and the session will be done. He is a distinguished professor and Chief Nadar University. He is at IIT Delhi. If we go back to his, he was the chair, the MS Volvo chair professor in transport planning. And also he is one of the intellectuals. And if you are interested in readings in general about his position on COVID and many other aspects, you can look him up. And I read his recent article on COVID, and it was a very interesting one. Thanks, Professor Mohan, for being with us, and you can start.
Thank you very much for inviting me to the series. I feel as a bit of an interloper in the sense that I really don't know where among the viewers, how many are from North America and Europe, and how many are from South America and Africa and Asia. But since I live in India, you'll see that quite a bit of my presentation will reflect where I live. But I hope that because I believe that a lot of things are international, and theory is international, science international, but how you actually use knowledge sometimes has to become more local. And to use science, which is international, and use it for your own benefit, you have to do a lot of research locally. And I think I'll try and project that as we go along. I would also like to remind many of you that many years ago, Jane Jacobs wrote her first book, I think in 1962, on cities. And she talked about why cities had to be vibrant, and there had to be eyes on the street and presence on the street, and they have to have mixed neighborhoods. And that's now 60 years ago. And what's very interesting is that it has not really caught on. Where it's being done in many European cities and in North American cities, it's also a part of gentrification. And so the vibrant neighborhoods of very popular cities in North America have done well. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, because I got a little signal here that I was muted.
No.
Anyway, so what interests me is that though we know a lot of things, have been saying the same things for many years regarding sustainability, climate change, sustainable transport, etc., mixed neighborhoods, but things don't change that fast. And I'm personally at a loss why it doesn't. And I think it's for the younger viewers of this seminar to take upon themselves to answer that question. Because those of us who have worked in the last 30, 40 years are leaving you behind not a very nice world. And so obviously we have failed in how to make it nicer, both in human rights and transport and cities and so on. So very often when we praise what's a very nice city in North America or Western Europe, very often that part of a city is accompanied by gentrification, and the poor people have been thrown out to make it nice. And I think we have to think about that. What I want to show you here is that when we talk about exclusion, what we talk about exclusion is how transport makes people less equal, because some people are not able to access. If you look at the items on the left, because of how transport operates and the expenses involved, that they're not able to access work. They're not able to access the place of learning they want to go to. And very important, they very often can't access healthcare when they immediately need it. Because one thing which was forgotten is that most of us get sick at home. We don't get sick in the hospital. But hospitals are not near our homes, the way zoning is done and how buildings are made. So we forget a lot of these connections regarding, what happens on where should hospitals be, or where should doctors be, or where should doctors' clinics be. They need to be close to your homes because you get sick at home. Access to food shops. And I think that's terribly important, especially in North America, because the poor parts of the city don't have the same food shops as the rich parts of the city. And the shops which sell food in the poorer parts of the city will sell food which is not very nutritious. So it's not only just access, but it's also what they're sold. Then of course, access to social, cultural, and other activities. And if you're talking about what we think is cultural, that's usually in the richer parts of the city. Access to sporting activities, and that's also because in the neoliberal capitalist world, because land prices, only richer neighborhoods have larger parks, have larger recreation areas, etc. So, and because you don't have cheap transport or free transport, you can't even go to sporting activities. And then convenient housing. What we mean by convenient housing is that you should be able to live so that the family is able to go to work or school in a convenient way, and so that you don't have to go too far. But again, because of land pricing, that and the way transport is organized, that becomes difficult. So when we look at all this, this exclusion, what are the reasons? So there's no single reason, and I've listed them on the right, that the reasons can be single, or usually, or most often, the reasons are multiple, which is travel distance, cost of transport, and we'll discuss this. I'll just list them here. Availability and physical of transport, and fear of crime. And I think that's a serious problem when people want to travel, especially in the evening and night, coming back from work in poorer neighborhoods. And one of the most important issues, if you want to promote public transport, bicycling, and walking, is that the fear of road accidents. It's very interesting that both in North America and Europe, especially English-speaking countries, 30, 40 years ago, a majority of the kids went to school walking or cycling. And today, that number, though all the facilities exist, that number has come down to 10, 15% in many cities. And that's a combination of fear of crime and parents really worried that their children might get involved in a road accident. Then of course, there's a gender issue where women face serious problems, and that was a very interesting study done in Stockholm quite a while back, about 30 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, that they found that women avoided using subways, underground subways. And when they interviewed them, they talked about crime, that they face men who bother them, and also and violence. But when they looked at the numbers, it was very interesting that more men were involved in physical problems in subways than women. And then there was a very interesting researcher there who said that it's not the same. The numbers don't make a difference, because if a woman is assaulted by a man, that leaves a much longer imprint and unhappiness in the woman's life than a man is attacked by a man, which may or it may just go away. And so again, just if you take all this into account, then where you have all these uh, uh, locations of facilities, it puts you at a disadvantage. Now, this issue of social exclusion because transport has been studied and discussed in North American and Western European countries for a while, but there's not been that much progress actually over the last 20 years. And I'm just quoting a few of these studies here, that it's part of the problem is that policy making has been sorry, I think I switched I'm sorry, I don't know how to operate. Sorry, I'm back. So the social exclusion is in most societies is misunderstood, poorly defined, and theoretically sound measure of transport is almost absent in all projects, and that's even today. And secondly, if you look at what Mies says almost 20 years ago, that social equity problems caused by transport have not gone, and equity would remain an issue even in the unlikely event that a non-polluting car could be invented. And when we talk about sustainability and so on, we are constantly talking about non-polluting vehicles. But land use patterns are arranged to suit the automobile. And with dispersed activities and wide roads and large car parks, inappropriate extension, cost benefit analysis. And this is a terribly important part, that the cost benefit analysis, which is used to analyze and approve all development projects in transport, which theoretically we know are not valid, are still being used. So the question one has to ask, and I will not be able to answer that in this seminar, is such issues which have what we call a historical context, and they have a inevitability because of the historical context. Can you solve them quickly when your philosophical new liberal economic regimes are operating? Now, all of us can immediately say that, but if the new liberal economic regime is going to continue, should we just stop worrying about these things? I would say no. But it is an issue which we have to consider. The other thing which has happened is that over the last 100 years, cities have become much larger. And I'll discuss this a little bit in the next few slides. Very large cities have different structures and forms in different parts of the world. But because cities are large, and most of the research comes from North America and Western Europe, there's a focus to that and what we understand. And that policy making gets focused on mechanized transport, and that's been true for long distance. And so especially now, whenever we talk about transport, we are always giving long distance transport a lot of importance. But even in large cities all over the world, most trips are less than 5 kilometers. The other thing which has happened is that uh, though uh, cities in the US were segregated by ethnicity, uh, but not much more than Europe. But over time, as cities have grown and immigration has increased, they have become much more complex socially and economically. And now the segregation is there by income, ethnicity, and religion. And this causes problems we'll discuss. Then there's an obsession with faster means of transport. Uh, and saving time. Though we've known for at least 50 years now that people actually don't save time. Most people have a travel budget because I have a travel budget, which is very small. So all my life, I've lived very close, no matter where I worked, I've lived close to my work. But that's one proportion of the population. But on average, people have a travel budget, and that goes anywhere from, say, 1 hour to 2 hours a day. And so no matter what you do, they're going to use that budget for travel. So if you give them a faster means of transport, then they'll move further away from their place of work to a cheaper uh, uh, land use area so they can have a bigger house. And so what this means is that then people, because of this, people get segregated by income. And also in some parts of the world, because people are segregated by income and offices are not now in the center of the city, many offices are in very rich suburban areas. And because of offices locating to rich suburban areas, the poorer parts, poorer sections of society who live in downtown areas of cities which are poorer, they have a commuting problem. And lastly, that post-colonial society, I want to make an issue of this, that because not much work is done and very little work is done in a part of the world, that post-colonial cities are different from European cities and North American cities for many reasons, which we don't have the time to, but they are different in Africa and Asia. Mature European cities would be on the left, you see what I give some ideas what mature European cities look like. And the older cities in North America have also similar qualities. That in mature European cities, the segregation took place mostly by class, except in the US, where it was also by race. But in all post-colonial cities, segregation takes place by class, color, ethnicity, language, and religion. What's interesting now is that because of some migration into European cities and American cities, which is being resisted, this segregation, which we experience here, is also taking place there. The interesting thing is that migration is not new. Migration has been going on in large numbers for 60,000 years. But people could migrate where they wanted to, except in the last 100 years, there were no visas. They could go wherever they felt like. The visa is only 100 years old. And that's why the issue of migration becomes important, because now we have visas. So we can say that, you're not supposed to be here. Then one very important difference in rich country cities and our parts of the world is that the central business district is very critical in mature European and old American cities. And because there's a very, very active and rich and dense central business district, you can have radial lines for public transport. But in post-colonial cities, you don't have very important central business districts anymore. There are multiple districts, business districts. There are multiple divisions in the city. So our large cities are cities within cities. So for example, I'll just say New Delhi. New Delhi is not one city, it's about 20 cities. And so our sprawl is not the same as the traditional large city sprawl. Public transport was mainly rail before cars. So that means most public transport was rail, and cars were expensive in Europe and North America before the Second World War. So middle class had to use public transport. But what's happened in our part of the world is that because of motorcycles, that has changed completely. And so it's not easy for public transport to operate. Again, in the 20th century, the factories were very important in cities, but now factories have moved out, there's a manual labor, and service and informal sector has become important. In some Western cities, there's congestion charging, expensive parking, but in our part of the world, congestion charging becomes difficult because of the way cities are, and it's easy for businesses to move. So if you have congestion charging in central Delhi or Mumbai or central Johannesburg or wherever, business will just move out and over time. And so that it's not a very easy decision to make. At present, car ownership may be peaking in rich societies, but car ownership will not peak for some time in our parts of the world. And as far as sustainable transport is concerned and climate change, in all the rich cities, transport is a major source of pollution. However, in our part of the world, vehicles contribute less than 30% of the pollution. And so these are problems in trying to make transport more equitable. Just to give you an idea, if you look at gender, it's a serious problem because this is just for Indian cities. If you look at the ratio of men to women, you see that men in transport outnumber women in India by a huge amount. And that's for many reasons, but it's also because the women in transport, women at work are much fewer in countries like India than say Sweden. But as we'll discuss later, this huge disparity is also probably because women face exclusion. If you look at this is a portion of commuters in India traveling by different modes. And what I find very interesting is that though most of the commuters who walk are traveling less than 1 kilometer, but there's a huge number which are going up to 5 kilometers and quite a large number which are going up to 10 kilometers. And this is very interesting, which means that this walking situation, the huge numbers of people walking in Indian cities is probably because of poverty, because walking 7-8 kilometers in the heat is not a very comfortable issue. But the other thing which I want to point out is that if you look at long distance travel, which is greater than 20 kilometers, it's very interesting that the bus proportion in buses is more than in cars. So what that probably tells me is that in poorer societies, if a person has to travel long distance to work, they can't afford a car, therefore the bus is the only way they can get there. But if you look at what's happening here is that the mode changes as you go longer distances. And so once you have mechanized transport easily available and facilities for mechanized transport, the distance you travel increases, which partly tells you that you have a time budget. So if you can go faster, you'll travel longer distances. But however, if you had to have a norm for this, you should say that most people should spend less than 2 hours per day on the computer, ideally about an hour. But in many parts of the world, more than a quarter are spending much more than 2 hours per day. So which is actually increased in the past years. And this also causes exclusion. This is Indian cities data. And the reason I'm showing this is that if 30% are walking, 70% are bicycling, and 15% are going in public transport, and only 5% overall for India are going in cars and in cars, and say 22% in motor. So personal transport is only 27%. Now this is what we say is the ideal for sustainable transport. Then if Asian and African countries already have the right proportions on what is considered sustainable, then what's the problem? So if this already exists, then because of poverty, then why are we doing badly? And they're not easy answers for any of this. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that our concerns are that if you use a motorcycle, bus, or car, and if you don't want to go spend more than 30 minutes one way, then you should live within 10 kilometers of work. If you want to bicycle, you have to live within 6, and if you want to walk, you want to live within 3 kilometers, which means that if you can't afford public transport or a car, then all the poor people should live close to their work. And this has a serious issue on our land policies. So what are the concerns? But if people have to go long distances for travel, and in many of our cities, the poor people are displaced to the peripheries so that our cities become world-class, what happens? The poor really suffer because they don't have help at home. And so the children suffer, they can't read, they can't do, so there's a problem of segregation. Then there is segregation and polarization and fragmentation by ethnicity, by color, by religion, etc. And because you're separating people and sending them away long distances, they can have reduced educational opportunities. And because some people don't have productive jobs, so the whole family suffers. And if people live far away from work, some people in the family may not be able to get jobs. And they have less because you're far away from health facilities, you have poorer health. And because the parents work far away from home, there's less attention to the family. And so we see that when the slums are far away from work and the slums are on the periphery of the city, there's very little work on this, but there's evidence that families break down and there's more crime with young adults. So once we say, we know what the problems are. So problem of road safety. So what has been suggested for years, that city blocks should be less than 500 meters square, because the shorter the block and the more junctions you have, it seems that there are less deaths, which is contrary to public understanding that if you have more junctions, you'll have more accidents. But it appears that if your city blocks are smaller and you have more junctions per kilometer on a road, you have fewer deaths, and it's probably because people are driving slower. You have to have sidewalks with a tree line so that they shade and people use sidewalks and don't walk on the road. You have to have a dedicated bicycle facilities so that they don't have conflicts with other vehicles. All this is known, I'm just repeating it. And you must have frequent safe road crossings that if the block is less than 500 meters, then within 200 meters, 150 meters, you can cross the road. If most streets are less than 30 meters wide, then children, adults can cross the road with less than 30 seconds, which is most pedestrian times. And inside cities, if speeds are less than 40 kilometers an hour, and all residential streets to have traffic on. So this takes care of the fear of road safety. Safety and crime is a major issue which causes exclusion, so that many people don't go out of their homes or don't take jobs, especially women. So there has been a lot of discussion on this, and Jane Jacob was the first one to talk about this on Eyes in the Street, which means that most major roads must have businesses on the ground floor. They must have kiosks and cafes, and in other parts of the world, hawkers and vendors, because they keep the streets safe from crime. Because all hawkers and vendors know the authorities, the municipal authorities, and the police authorities intimately, because they deal with them every day. So wherever you have street vendors, you have much less crime. And all this causes a vibrant walking atmosphere. Natural surveillance, which means there should be no hiding places on the road. Places should be well lit. And you design your space which expresses ownership of the place. And it makes you think that this is not a road. This is, a part of society, which artwork, signage, landscaping, etc. And now we do know that policing and CCTV cameras actually do not reduce crime that much. There's a systematic review of CCTV cameras effectiveness all over the world. And it shows that CCTV cameras actually don't reduce crime except in parking lots. But it makes a lot of money for all the security agencies. So CCTV cameras are good for solving major crimes after the crime occurs, but they don't seem to prevent crime. And therefore, natural systems are better for promoting safety and reducing crime than technical methods. I'm not going to spend too much time on public transport, because I'm looking at the list of your seminars on transport. I think people much better equipped than me will be talking about it. But I want to make a few important points. That the Western literature shows that people can spend up to 10% of their income on transport. I would like to submit that in many societies, now even in the West, that the poorest people should not be spending any money on transport, because that money goes away from their family health, from children's books and laptops and so on and so forth. So every country has to decide, every city has to decide what is the minimum income at which people can afford public transport. And below that, people need to live so that they're close to work and they can cycle and walk. And what that means is that poor people should live in pockets all over the city, almost like chicken pox in the city. And they shouldn't be in or outside the city or in various enclaves. Because if poorer people can live anywhere in the city, then they're close to work, because poorer people have skills which are needed all over the city. But this also means that you can't have private ownership of land completely. And there has to be public land available where poor people can live. As far as fares are concerned, the fare should be less, public transport fare should be less than the fuel expenditure, the cheapest mode of public transport, personal transport. Say in India, cheapest mode of personal transport is motorcycles. And motorcycles go about 50, 60, 70 kilometers per liter, which means that the cost of running a motorcycle is 2 or 3 American cents per kilometer. That means if the public transport fare is more than that, 2 or 3 cents per kilometer, then very few people who can own a motorcycle will use public transport. Therefore, there has to be subsidy of public transport, and that subsidy should come, I believe, locally from taxes on city residents, and it should largely not depend on federal money. And lastly, intermediate public transport services, which exist much more in our part of the world, which is tuk-tuks and three-wheelers and shared taxi in this and the other, they should be considered public transport. And they should be given an important component in making public transport policy. And all these things will reduce exclusion. So this will only happen if lower income groups get themselves heard politically. And I think that's a very important, these things can't be solved just technically. The technical solutions will only come if the poorer people are able to exert political pressure. Gender issues are much more difficult. We've been discussing them for some time. We've not made that much progress, but that there are differences at present because of the way we deal with gender issues in distance travel, mode of travel, and the complexity of trip making. Women seem to make more, do much more trip chaining, etc. They also obviously at present are more risk averse. So if there's crime on the street, less of them would go out. In many parts of the world, there's family pressure and social norms which inhibit them from going out alone. And of course, harassment on the road and in the public transport system. And I think that has to be solved by natural design methods and of course, changes in society, which is long term. So there are no technical quick fixes. And I think these issues have to be made more public so that there's much more social and political discussion and action and debate. And over time, hopefully it improves. This is something which is terribly important as far as segregation and exclusion is concerned in transport, that in our cities, how people live is becoming more segregated by religion, ethnicity, and especially in those places which have recent immigrants. Because then what happens is that if one group is living in one part of the city, then everything becomes longer distance for them. But forget all the other issues of income, et cetera, et cetera. So if segregation is increasing in many cities, this will cause a lot of transport exclusion. And there's very little work has been done on this. And I don't see many good studies from anywhere in the world. And I think this is something which some of you can take up to see how segregation, residential segregation of religion, ethnicity, and influences on how you live and work and travel. So we really need to have much more work on this. So I would like to end by saying that there's a role of the state also, and that you have to treat access and mobility as a public good. We have to give up, we've been talking about this for years, but we still have zoning policies. And of course, ensuring streets follow universal design. And also, I think many more people in the transportation field have to be familiar with crime prevention through environmental design, CPTED. There are professional groups are working on this, but they're not very well known to transport people. And this tells you how just design makes a difference in crime. We have to then also try and understand how to introduce efficient and affordable public services supported by local taxes. How do you introduce local taxes in the new liberal world? We also need new policies and ideas which make it possible for IPT services to operate, which is intermediate public transport services, and they should be considered public transport. So I would say we have enthusiasm and scientific promise, but we really do not have a logically determinate procedure yet. We don't really know why we're not able to do what we want to do. We need a shift in theoretical methods, and this will not come by people like me and established scientists. we have too much stake in existing methods because we have understood development by accumulation, what we learned over the years. And if something doesn't suit us, we don't want to admit it because we are responsible for what is there at present. So it's very important for newer people to discover what's happening by looking at anomalies in the public space and natural experiments. And I think it's very, very important, and this will come, I think, quite a bit by looking at the poorer cities, because there are natural experiments going on. And it's very important to look at why people are doing what they're doing, because they're finding solutions under the most difficult conditions. So there's a huge amount, and that's what I mean. The good news is that a lot of this is going on, but we're not studying it. So it gives us fantastic opportunity to do original research. And the difference between the post-colonial cities and the old cities might point the way to the future. And I think we have to do some very, very serious evaluation why our current systems have not worked as well as we wanted them to. And I think I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mohan, for this this excellent presentation. There's a lot of questions. So let me start by, let's not ignore the elephant in the room first, which is COVID-19.
Yes.
And you wrote recently about COVID-19 and how the major lockdown impacted the immigrants and impacted people's jobs. What do you think this has impacted the accessibility to services in India, for example?
Well, see, the biggest problem has been because of the lockdown, your public transport system has become very inefficient or inaccessible. And I think because of that, a lot of people have lost jobs, a lot of people can't meet friends, and the socialization has stopped. And I think human beings who can't socialize, except a few, there's a proportion of society who are loners. They shouldn't be forced to socialize. And they were not socializing before also. But I think it has really impacted the health, well-being, and psychiatric status of individuals. And I think it'll affect also our innovative capabilities in the future, because if human beings don't meet in bars, restaurants, socially, innovation can't take place. So I think this COVID business will really impact the scare, because this is the first time that rich people have got scared with the disease. And because very rich people have got scared, they've scared the whole world and made it impossible. And because the rich people don't work with their hands, they can work from home, so it doesn't bother them. But the non-rich people have to work with their hands, and the question from working from home does not arise, and they're starving. So I think it's going to have terrible consequences.
You touched on surveillance a little bit
Yes.
in how surveillance. So COVID is forcing us to surveillance, and will it magnify also the inequalities, because we'll see more people getting COVID because they don't have the smartphones and how this.
I'm not so worried about more people getting COVID because when epidemics happen and so on and so forth, these things will happen. And all we have to do is have to go to medical care for people who are serious. But under this system, for example, in many countries, including mine, because of COVID, all protests and criticism of the government is finished. You can't protest anymore. You can't say anything against, and so on and so forth. So I think normal discourse is being affected, and education is being affected, because most children, if you're a parent, you know that children, and of course, if you remember your own school days, most children hate going to school initially. And the only reason they learn is because they're forced to go to school. And eventually some of them start liking school, not because what they're learning there, because they meet friends there. And so I think it's going to be quite complicated.
I faced this today in the morning with my son. He didn't want to go to school. He wanted to stay home. So
because
I can
also,
relate.
to answer, also once you are teaching online, you can't be completely honest. And you have to become more pro-government. So it's going to have many, many, many side effects.
Going deep into some of the things you touched on, Aisha is asking in developing countries, why do women face exclusion no matter what mode they're using of transport?
I should not say why in developing countries, not such a long time back that in Switzerland women couldn't vote. So we time, we just look at, time is a long period of time. If women in Switzerland could not vote just a few decades ago, we don't make it hard for everyone that everyone's horrible. It'll take time as people get richer, meet each other in colleges and universities and so on. Things should become better. Not necessarily, after all, a large number of women voted for Trump. So it doesn't say very well about women. So, and their concept of freedom. The point is that I think we have histories of subjugation of women in many of our societies, which is taking much longer to go away. There is also research that when societies start becoming middle class, initially, then women are treated differently because they no longer are seen to be labor providers. And less of them work, and it happened in the US in the 50s, for example. And something like that is happening in our countries also, which is unfortunate. And so when women are not seen as economic help, in addition to the traditional prejudice, they face more prejudice and they don't have power. So I think it's very important for women to be seen as equals, and whether they work or don't work, they produce equal support for families and for humankind. And I think there has to be support from design. But in societies where women face more prejudice, we should clean up our designs, street designs, home designs, so that there's much more public, open space where everyone can be seen if they're doing something wrong, to help women and weak sections and the senior citizens and so on. I don't have any clear solutions for these difficult problems because I've lived for many decades living with the bad stuff. And if it was easy to resolve it, I would be terribly happy. But
it's complex.
You have to keep working at it.
You have to keep working. Speaking about some of the details, some of the questions came digging into your thing, saying in India, it is the middle class and the poorer communities that use bus and rail the most.
Sorry?
So, now there is, and railways are already running at a loss.
Yes.
And at the same time, there's a big sweep of privatization of public transport.
Yes.
That's going there. So in order to deal with the situation, with the loss, you're still calling for free public transport. So what is your thought about that? Like, would allowing the poor to travel be counterproductive? Because now you're driving it down to more loss?
You see, when
So
we
make
say,
the government sell more?
I think the rich have been subsidized much more than the poor. After all, when you buy a gallon of petrol in North America, it costs a little bit more than Coca-Cola per gallon. How do you compare the two? Someone must be subsidizing petrol by wars and killing people all over the world, because you're pumping oil out from thousands of feet from under the ground. You're cleaning it up, then they're transporting it across oceans, then pumping it out of petrol pumps and selling it at the same price as Coca-Cola, which is just some water with essence in it. I don't understand this economics. I don't understand this concept of subsidy. So when public transport improves the economy of the whole society, why should it not be free? After all, education is free in high school. Public health is free in most sensible societies except US. And so public transport is a public good. And it should not be, and it should be subsidized by local citizens, by the city. You should not depend on national governments to do it, because if the taxation is local, then the local people will put pressure on the local government to keep it working well so that their money is well spent. So I have no problem in saying that transportation should be free. And just because there were people called Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and Bush in the West doesn't mean we should suffer.
Lake Sagarius from Chile, she has a first, she's saying hi and she's saying, praising you for the excellent summary of the talk. And oh, she disappeared again. Okay, I was planning on unmuting her. If I ask her to unmute, and she can ask her question directly. Ask to unmute.
Yes, yes, Lake.
Thank you very much. I'm having lunch, so I didn't want to be on camera for that. But thanks for the chance to ask a question. We've had an ongoing dialogue about this. We get a few words in each time we see each other somewhere in the world. But it seems to me that the driving question behind what you're talking about, why haven't we had the socio-political cultural change necessary to make these discoveries or this knowledge a reality on streets all over the world, is largely because of the divorce between transportation, engineering, and heavily masculinized disciplines not allying effectively with the social sciences. And that when we work together, I'm a planner and a social scientist and a poet originally, we really start to get major changes. And I think the cycling movement is a really good example of that, and now Walk 21, where they've reached out way beyond the technical limitations to have major debates, major lessons, major sharing about how to make our cities better. And indeed, there is an explosion of change that's not exploratory at this point. It's based on fundamentado science, well-founded science. So Paris or Montreal or Bogota or Mexico, the changes they're making during COVID are the result of some of the STEM, and particularly engineering and design, working together with the social sciences to get changes.
Well, I'm glad you make that point in the sense that we have to work together, but I must say that the changes which have taken place in the West are very small. The travel distance by car is still increasing per year. Travel by plane is still increasing by year, and so on and so forth. And societies where 50% or 70% people own cars, they can't tell societies where 7% own cars not to own cars. I think it's very racist. So the point is that Indians can say that when we reach your level of car ownership, then we'll start walking. So the point is there's a path dependence. I don't see any country in the world which changes so quickly with modern technology unless most people have aspirations have been filled. because it is the middle class which decides what to do. And for example, in my university, which is, and everyone who works for my university as a faculty member is in the top 5% of our income level. But a large proportion of the faculty members in my university, when they get a job, they will be the first generation to own a car. And I think it's just psychologically, I don't see how you can tell them not to buy a car. People who owned a car can say, I'm getting rid of it. And thirdly, I think all the international big time NGOs at times do harm, because especially through international philanthropists, they have huge power over our governments. And local researchers have no role anymore. And local researchers have no respect anymore. They have just become data suppliers to Western experts. So unless local researchers are respected, their understanding is respected, and much more money is put into local research, these solutions won't come just because someone in the world says you should do it. It has to come from within. It has to come because local people are saying this is what we want to do. And local people have to experience it. And just because you know that a large proportion of marriages don't work in North America doesn't mean many people don't, most people still get married. They want to experience it. So these are social human issues which are not easy to resolve without societies deciding themselves what to do from their life experience and their aspirations and what they see others have done. If our relatives from the US told us they don't own a car, then we would say we also won't own a car, but everyone we know owns a car in the US.
So just to support your point, but perhaps be a little more optimistic, in Chile, which is a society that has rapidly transitioned toward automobility, we joined forces, planners, social scientists, and transport engineers, and did a classic transportation intercept survey in 2 cities, but using social science questions about people's social imaginary related to transportation. And we almost fell off our chairs because, just as Dinesh says, I mean, people were just, everyone assumes that everyone's crazy to get a car. And what we found when we asked people where they thought more investment should go and where more road space should go, right across the board, pedestrians, cyclists, obvious, public transport users, but also car drivers were saying they thought that a lot more should go to cycling and quite a bit more to walking. And even a lot of drivers were saying, we think less road space and less investment should be going to cars. So I think that, and I think this is one of the big differences in societies in the global South as well, is that.
Well, by the way, in Delhi, when people were questioned, when the metro was being made, how many of you would use it? And the survey told us 92%. 92% and only 4% are using the metro. So everyone says the correct thing.
Will they do it?
Anyway,
So,
I don't think that was the correct thing to say by the official rules. It was a very unofficial and very resistance-oriented response. But anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dinesh. I don't want to hold you more because I know it's late at night and we reached our time.
I sleep late, so if you want, we can continue for a few minutes.
Okay, I'll end with one because we can't end without a political question, a loaded political question. Okay, so Daniel Belbas asked, you mentioned that the poor need to become more politically organized, but the world is becoming more authoritarian and polarized along identity, political divisions, and others. So how can we change that? I know it's a little bit far from transport, but
you see, the historic, so there's a problem with the concept of democracy at present. Because in most countries, it's first past the post. And the concept of the nation state has come from Europe. And the nation state believes in, the way it was formulated was one religion, one language. So the nation state will always, a democratic nation state, by democratic I meaning the current parliamentary elections, will always, capitalist democratic nation state will always move towards authoritarianism and religious fundamentalism over time. So we have, the younger people who are much younger than me have to find newer ways of dealing with how to make our societies more democratic, because a Western capitalist parliamentary electoral democratic state is not working and will not work. And you can see that from almost every country around the world, except very, very small countries like New Zealand or Finland or whatever. But the current concept of capitalist democratic nation state will promote huge disparities of income, huge billionaires who will control prime ministers and presidents, and they'll call themselves philanthropists who go around the world now funding sustainable transport and road safety and BRT and so on and so forth. And they actually destroy democratic functioning of the countries they go to, because they have much disproportionate power over local people. And if you want to read about this, there's a book published in the US called Winners Take All, which is a very good discussion on the negative influence of the world's greatest philanthropists today. So I think we've gone through a century of hope, which was very good, and we've learned a lot. And I think for people who are 50 years younger than me, or 20, 40 years younger than me, I think that all of you, I can see some of you, you have to work on this and not take this for granted. That the present system of a nation state, all of us are, many of us are facing this. A nation state can't work where you have many religions. The current form of nation state can't work where you have many religions, many languages, and many ethnicities. And this has also happened with the colonialists. Because they colonize nations, they also have immigrants. So they have to solve the problem now. But anyway, I think there's enough discussion on this. And therefore I'm optimistic that over time people will find ways to get around it. And I think we have to go back to more local action. And that's why I stress the fact that funding for local public transport should come from local taxation. And that can only happen if people who need public transport make noise and so on and so forth, and demonstrations and block streets and stop cars from moving, etc. So, which is not going to happen just now because they'll be shot. But I think we have to think about different methods of doing it. And you can see some of that happening in the climate change business. But climate change is a safe thing to do. What we are talking about is not that safe because there are vested interests against what we are saying. A government, it's much easier for a government to fund a metro because all the embassies in your country will support, European embassies in the country will support it, and foreign experts. But it's much more difficult to provide better sidewalks because you don't need foreign experts for that. And you don't need international experts. You don't need international NGOs. You don't need World Bank. So good transport is not a technical issue. Good transport is a societal issue which will be, is I would say, pushed by politics. And when pushed by politics, then work gets done. And when politicians want it, more research gets done. And I think the role of international NGOs has reduced that. by telling politicians, we know what to do in your country, and you don't need to do anything except listen to us. So I think once governance becomes more local, and when politicians have to listen to their local people, and I'm saying this for every city in the world, not for us, that once governance becomes more local, and when people have to find solutions, they also have to see what's happening internationally. Okay, so if I have to find solutions for Delhi, I can't shut my eyes. I have to read everything what's happening around the world to understand what's happening, then find my own solutions. So I'm not talking about going into a frog's well at all. What I'm saying is that once you're pushed locally, the chances are, not always, for example, there is no evidence that a dictator has, in history, no dictator has been brought down by democratic processes. So these are very difficult issues, and we have to understand them.
Thank you so much. And
I hope that was political enough.
That was political enough, and the entire talk was amazing and inspiring, and we have to digest a lot. Thank you so much, Professor Mohan.
Thank you.
Next week we will have the seminar. We'll be switching gears to transport for children with disabilities with Professor Ron Billing. So if anyone attending the seminar is interested, you can log in and register online. Thank you so much again, Professor Mohan. It was really inspiring and an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.